The winter of 1944 descended upon the Western Front with a brutal, paralyzing cold. The quiet sector of the Ardennes forest stretched across Belgium and Luxembourg, a deceptive lull in the fury of the war. This seemingly peaceful, snow-draped landscape was the chosen point of attack for Adolf Hitler's final, desperate gamble. The German plan, codenamed Wacht am Rhein, or Watch on the Rhine, was audacious in its scope and nearly suicidal in its execution. It aimed to smash through the thinly held Allied lines, seize the critical port of Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace on the Western powers. Across the front lines, the seasoned German veterans prepared for their last great offensive of the war. These men had seen years of brutal combat, from the frozen steppes of Russia to the scorching sands of North Africa. They had witnessed the relentless attrition of the Wehrmacht and carried the heavy weight of their nation's looming defeat. As they peered across the snowy no man's land, they saw what they believed was a soft target for their attack. They saw American forces that were a patchwork of overstretched divisions and, crucially, large numbers of fresh, untested replacement troops. The American replacements, or replaces, were largely young men who had arrived in Europe late in the war. Many had received truncated, hurried training, designed to fill the gaping holes left by the high casualties of the summer and fall campaigns. The German High Command and the veterans on the ground viewed these new American soldiers with a palpable, dismissive contempt. They were seen as soft, unprepared boys, too concerned with their clean uniforms and their ample, well-stocked rations. Intelligence reports and frontline observations fueled this German belief in American military softness. The German troops, veterans of countless engagements, fully expected a quick, devastating rout of these new, inexperienced opponents. They anticipated a collapse of resistance that would allow their panzers to race through the woods and reach the Meuse River on schedule. This initial German perception was rooted in a deep-seated professional arrogance, forged in the early victories of the Blitzkrieg. They believed their own enduring hardship and superior battle experience would immediately overwhelm any green American unit. The stage was set for a confrontation where one side massively underestimated the other's capacity for endurance and brutal, necessary learning. This underestimation was a crucial and ultimately fatal miscalculation by the German planners. The Ardennes was about to become the most important and bloody battlefield for these American newcomers. The forest held a grim classroom where the cost of a soldier's education was often his life. The world watched, unaware that a massive, unexpected battle was about to define the final chapter of the Western Front. The arrival of the American replacement soldiers was often an anticlimactic and confusing affair. They disembarked from ships and trains onto the European continent, quickly shuttled toward the front with little fanfare. These men were the lifeblood of the American war machine, hastily organized to sustain the relentless offensive momentum across France and Belgium. They were a diverse group, pulled from training camps across the United States. Some were fresh out of high school, others were older men diverted from civilian life, all thrust into a war they were only vaguely prepared to fight. Their uniforms were crisp, their boots new, and their gear often pristine, a stark contrast to the mud-caked, threadbare appearance of the frontline veterans. This superficial difference immediately created a rift between the newcomers and the soldiers who had already endured months of combat. The veterans, who had seen their comrades fall, viewed the replacements with a mixture of pity and resentment. They saw them as temporary fillers, cannon fodder whose lack of experience posed a risk to the whole unit. The term replacements became a label carrying a distinct undertone of expendability and inexperience. Frontline soldiers often referred to them with cynical jokes and harsh dismissals. One prevalent sentiment was the fear that the greenhorns would panic in combat, thus exposing their more experienced squad mates to unnecessary danger. Many of the replacements were sent to the quiet sectors like the Ardennes for what was called on-the-job training. The commanders believed this low-intensity area would allow them to acclimate to the stress of the front without immediate, catastrophic engagement. This was a fundamentally flawed assumption, as the German attack was poised to strike exactly these soft points. The quiet, seemingly benign forests were, in reality, a powder keg waiting for a spark. The replacements spent their first weeks digging in, adjusting to the cold, and learning the rudimentary, life-saving rules of trench warfare. They learned to sleep with one eye open, to distinguish friendly sounds from hostile ones, and to cope with the pervasive, bone-chilling cold. This brief period of relative calm instilled a false sense of security in some. They had yet to experience the truly overwhelming terror of a sustained, large-scale German assault. Meanwhile, the German veterans, conducting reconnaissance across the lines, saw these new arrivals as proof of American desperation. They noted the replacements' often sloppy fieldcraft and their occasional, telltale signs of inexperience. The Germans interpreted their newness not as a sign of vast American reserve, but as a weakness in the deployed forces. This perception of a weak link in the American armor was a major factor in the German confidence leading up to the Great Winter Attack. The replacements were unknowingly standing at the very epicenter of the coming storm. From the German perspective, the American replacements confirmed every propaganda-fueled stereotype. German veterans held a deep-seated belief in their own military and cultural superiority, which the appearance of the new GIs only reinforced. The German fighting men, often operating with cobbled-together equipment and meager rations, saw the well-fed, well-equipped Americans as soft. They noted the abundance of American logistics, contrasting it sharply with their own grinding shortages. The replacements' initial battlefield conduct often provided fresh fodder for German derision. There were accounts of inexperienced GIs firing their weapons at imagined threats or abandoning positions due to panic. These understandable errors of green troops were amplified and discussed with contempt in German foxholes and command posts. The German veterans had survived the worst fighting in the East and West. They viewed their American counterparts as amateur soldiers who had entered the conflict late and were enjoying a war that was already largely decided. Their scorn was not just professional, it was personal and ideological. They believed the Americans lacked the necessary hardness, the heart, required to endure prolonged, brutal combat. Stories circulated among the German troops about the replacements' inability to handle the severe cold or their dependence on comforts like chocolate and cigarettes. These anecdotes, often exaggerated, created a collective narrative that the American front was brittle and ready to shatter under a concentrated attack. The German veterans were confident that the initial American line would crumble almost instantly. They expected the replacement heavy units to fold after the first heavy artillery barges and concentrated infantry pushes. This overconfidence was a significant element of the psychological readiness for the offensive. They believed their own grim, hardened experience would simply roll over the American greenhorns. The mocking grin was a defense mechanism, a way for the German veterans to steel themselves for the bloody work ahead. It was a professional soldier's disdain for what they perceived as a vastly inferior adversary. However, this deeply ingrained contempt would soon lead to a shocking, brutal, and costly reversal of expectations. The German veterans failed to account for the American capacity for rapid, terrifying learning under pressure. They underestimated the core, unyielding tenacity that necessity would quickly forge in the hearts of these young men. The German laughter would soon be silenced by the surprisingly accurate, disciplined fire of the very men they mocked. The Ardennes had been designated by the Allied High Command as the primary sector for American troop rotation and training. It was seen as the quietest stretch of the Western Front, a place where exhausted divisions could recover and replacement units could gain experience. This was a deliberate strategic choice made by Allied planners who needed to commit the bulk of their veteran strength to offensive actions elsewhere. As a result, the American defensive line in the Ardennes was held by a dangerously thin screen of troops. Several divisions were either resting or composed largely of the new, untested replacement soldiers. This thinness of the line was a calculated risk, but one that was taken with a false sense of security. The Allied command believed the terrain was too rough and the weather too poor for a major armored offensive by the Germans. This intelligence failure was a catastrophic oversight that played directly into Hitler's hands. The German High Command was fully aware of the American deployment and specifically targeted these weak points. They knew the quality of the troops facing them and planned their massive armored thrust to exploit the inexperience. The German offensive was designed to achieve maximum speed, bypassing pockets of strong resistance and capitalizing on confusion. The key to the entire operation was the rapid disintegration of the American forward defenses. The replacement units were, therefore, the first and most critical hurdle for the German panzer armies. If the replacements held for even a few crucial hours, the entire, fragile German timetable would be thrown into chaos. If they broke and ran, the German tanks would be free to race for the Meuse River and Antwerp. The sector they occupied was a strategic vacuum, a place that held immense power for either side. The battle would hinge on the replacement's ability to improvise a defense against a veteran, all-out armored assault. They had limited heavy weapons, insufficient lines of communication, and little to no artillery support in the initial hours. They were essentially holding a critical section of the line with determination and small arms fire alone. Their role was not merely to fight, but to act as a crucial, time-buying speed bump for the entire Allied front. Every minute they held their ground was a minute gained for the Allied commanders to rush veteran divisions to the threatened sectors. The fate of the entire German offensive would be decided in the snow-covered woods where these green soldiers faced their first real combat. This seemingly insignificant thin line of replacements was the final, fragile key to the entire Battle of the Bulge. The attack began in the pre-dawn hours of December 16, 1944, with a ferocious, deafening artillery barrage. Thousands of German guns hammered the American positions, tearing apart communications lines and shattering the illusion of safety. The deep, unsettling calm of the Ardennes was instantly replaced by an apocalyptic, relentless roar of war. For the replacement soldiers, who had only practiced maneuvers and heard distant shelling, the experience was profoundly terrifying. This was not a drill. It was a sudden, violent confrontation with the full-scale brutality of the modern battlefield. Shells exploded in the dense pine woods, sending shrapnel and splintered wood flying through the air. The ground shook violently, and the air filled with the acrid smell of burnt propellant and pulverized earth. In the midst of this chaos, the German infantry, veteran soldiers moving with grim efficiency, began their swift advance. They emerged from the fog and snow, using the cover of the barrage to close rapidly on the American lines. The replacements were often isolated, their command structures severed by the initial artillery strike. Many were left to fight without clear orders, relying only on their basic training and the instinct to survive. The first moments of contact were chaotic and brutal. Units were overwhelmed by the speed and ferocity of the German assault. Initial casualties were high, with panic setting in among some of the least experienced men. However, the veterans on the German side were surprised by the stubbornness of the American resistance. Despite the chaos, pockets of American replacements quickly organized defensive fire. They held their ground, refusing to be dislodged easily, forcing the German advance to slow and engage. This unexpected tenacity was not the immediate collapse the German planners had banked upon. The replacements, facing an immediate existential threat, shed their greenness with terrifying speed. They learned in minutes what veteran soldiers learned over weeks. The sudden life-or-death pressure acted as a brutal, unforgiving forge for their fighting spirit. Their baptism of fire was a trial by shock and overwhelming force, yet many found a deep, unexpected well of courage. The German veterans who had expected a simple walkover were suddenly pinned down by accurate, desperate small arms fire. The battle for the Ardennes had begun not with a rout, but with a fierce, unexpected stand. The critical factor that saved the entire Allied line was the replacement troops' stubborn refusal to completely break and run. Though initial losses were heavy and some units were surrounded or overrun, the remaining men held their positions. They understood, perhaps only instinctively, that a quick retreat would guarantee disaster for everyone behind them. They fought with a ferocity born of desperation, using every piece of cover the snowy terrain offered. The dense forests and poor visibility, which the Germans had counted on to conceal their advance, now also shielded the Americans. The replacements learned to dig in quickly, often using frozen, half-dug positions to their advantage. They employed their limited anti-tank weapons, bazookas and hand grenades, with surprising bravery against the advancing German armor. In many instances, isolated squads of replacements held up entire companies of veteran German infantry for hours. Their sustained, defensive fire forced the elite German units to commit more time and resources to clearing pockets of resistance. Every skirmish, every hour of delay, was a critical blow to the German timetable. The replacements were not fighting with the practiced skill of veterans, but with a raw, unyielding grit. They were driven by the primal need to survive and defend their immediate comrades. The German advance began to grind to a halt in localized sectors, bogged down in small, brutal engagements. The Germans, trained for fluid, rapid warfare, found themselves in a static, costly slugfest they had not anticipated. The mocking contempt of the German veterans began to turn into a grudging, professional frustration. They were expending valuable ammunition and irreplaceable time against an enemy they had dismissed as soft. The American ability to hold up the first wave of attack, even in isolated, disorganized pockets, was a decisive, strategic victory. It gave General Eisenhower and his commanders the vital hours they needed to identify the main thrust of the attack. This delay allowed them to begin the massive, coordinated effort to shift powerful, veteran American and British divisions to the north and south. The replacements were buying time with their blood, and the cost was immense. The act of simply staying put and firing back in the face of a terrifying, overwhelming assault changed the course of the battle. As the hours turned into days, the initial German confidence rapidly evaporated into a cold, grim reality. The expected walkover of the American replacements had simply not materialized. The German armored divisions were not racing through the empty countryside. They were inching forward, constantly harassed and delayed. Reports filtering back to the German high command were filled with frustration and disbelief. The American greenhorns were showing a level of stubbornness and firepower that belied their lack of experience. The veteran German commanders began to recognize that their intelligence had fundamentally misjudged the American soldier. They realized the difference between an inexperienced soldier and an unwilling one. The replacements, while green, were highly motivated, well supplied, and determined to fight for their lives. The scorn turned into grudging respect, often articulated in frontline reports. German officers noted the Americans' rapid ability to adapt to tactical situations. They learned to respect the replacements' effective use of the terrain and their readiness to launch small, aggressive counterattacks. This shift in German perception was a major psychological victory for the Allies. The Germans could no longer count on the simple fear of the American soldier to win the day. They were forced to commit their valuable, finite resources to clearing every entrenched position. The strategic timetable was now hopelessly off track, a consequence of the unexpected American tenacity. The delay was critical, allowing Allied air superiority to begin to assert itself as the weather finally cleared. The German veterans, who had scoffed at the Americans' reliance on equipment, now found themselves facing a well-supplied, determined enemy. The initial grin of scorn had been replaced by a look of weary, professional dread. They were fighting not against boys who would run, but against men who were suddenly, violently, fighting for everything. The Battle of the Bulge had become a brutal, costly siege, not the swift, decisive breakthrough Hitler had envisioned. The true stories of courage emerged from the small, isolated actions of the replacement troops. These were not the medals won by famed veterans, but the quiet, desperate acts of men who had no choice but to be heroes. In the chaos, young lieutenants and sergeants, often replacements themselves, suddenly found themselves leading the defense. They organized desperate fire sectors, rallied demoralized men, and made life-and-death decisions under intense German fire. One common thread in the accounts was the replacement's ability to quickly learn how to support one another. When a machine gun crew was wiped out, another soldier, who had never operated the weapon before, would immediately take its place. The replacements showed a shocking resilience to the physical and mental stress of prolonged combat in freezing weather. They fought on without sleep, often without hot food, their bodies numb from the cold, and their minds reeling from the noise. Medics, newly arrived from training, performed life-saving triage in snowy foxholes, their hands shaking but their focus unwavering. Supply runners braved German lines to deliver essential ammunition and medical supplies, understanding the critical nature of their task. The men's inexperience was overcome by a powerful surge of collective will. They fought not for grand strategy or national glory, but for the life of the man next to them. This intense, localized loyalty proved to be an unbreakable foundation for the larger defense. The replacements quickly learned to shed their clean uniforms and their civilian habits. They became hardened soldiers in a matter of days, their fear replaced by a grim, effective determination. Their bravery was a silent, unsung factor that decisively altered the shape of the offensive. It was the courage of ordinary men, thrust into extraordinary circumstances, who found the strength to hold the line. The defense mounted by the replacement units created a series of small, unbreakable knots of resistance across the German advance. These small, localized battles completely disrupted the German strategy of rapid, flanking maneuver. The German panzers, designed for breakthrough, found themselves confronting heavily defended roadblocks. The replacements turned scattered towns and small forest clearings into costly, high-casualty obstacles. In one instance, a handful of replacements, using only a couple of anti-tank rockets, disabled several German tanks. This small victory sent a powerful message to the advancing enemy. They would have to fight for every single yard of ground. The relentless pressure forced the German command to feed their veteran infantry into the meat grinder of the American defense. This commitment of infantry was supposed to be a secondary task after the breakthrough. Instead, the veterans were tied down in close-quarters combat, taking heavy casualties they could ill afford. The replacements were not merely defending. They were inflicting a heavy, unsustainable toll on the German forces. Their unbroken defense was a testament to their inherent capacity for grit and their American training. The German army could not afford to lose so many experienced men and so much time in these peripheral engagements. The offensive's momentum stalled completely as the full weight of the American logistical and combat reserve began to arrive. The veteran divisions rushed in to relieve and reinforce the exhausted replacements. They found not broken units in full retreat, but small, battered groups of men still holding their ground, their weapons hot. The initial German advantage of surprise and superior battle experience had been neutralized by sheer, stubborn American resilience. The replacement's defense gave the entire Allied army the time and space to organize a massive and ultimately successful counterattack. The price of holding the line in the Ardennes was paid in the countless lives of the replacement soldiers. Many did not survive their baptism of fire, falling in the deep snow of the Belgian forests. The quiet, often unmarked graves scattered across the snowy landscape were a silent testament to their sacrifice. These were the men who died anonymously, their names initially known only to their squad mates and to the military bureaucracy. They arrived as boys and died as soldiers, often before they had fully learned the names of the men in their own platoons. Their story is not of great generals or famous campaigns, but of the immense personal cost of duty. The memory of their sacrifice became a foundational, unspoken bond for the veteran troops who fought alongside them. The veterans who had mocked them now fought beside them, respecting their profound, enduring courage. The replacement soldier's death ensured the survival and success of the main Allied force. Their bodies marked the farthest point of the German advance, a grim line in the snow that the enemy could not cross. The sheer number of casualties suffered by these inexperienced units highlights the intensity of the fighting they faced. They were in the path of the most concentrated German force, and they bore the brunt of the initial shock. As the battle turned and the Americans began to push back, the legacy of the replacements became clear. The Allied victory was built on the foundation of their selfless, desperate stand. The cold, white landscape of the Ardennes became a silent, sprawling cemetery for these young heroes. Their names are now forever etched into the honor rolls of the Battle of the Bulge. The story of the replacements is the story of the necessary, unglamorous soldier who makes the ultimate sacrifice. When the fighting ended and the German offensive was finally defeated, the survivors offered a new perspective on their American foes. Captured German veterans, initially full of contempt, spoke with a new, somber respect for the American replacements. They admitted their shock at the unexpected tenacity and resilience of the men they had dismissed as soft. The German soldiers had encountered a fighting spirit they had not anticipated in the young Americans. One veteran reportedly stated that the Americans fought not like professional soldiers, but like men defending their homes. This observation speaks volumes about the replacement's sheer, unyielding determination to hold their positions. The German veterans had learned a painful, costly lesson about judging an enemy based on appearances and propaganda. They had underestimated the vast resourcefulness and deep reserves of the American military system. They saw that American inexperience was quickly replaced by a fierce, instinctive competence born of combat necessity. The mocking grin was permanently replaced by a look of defeat and professional acknowledgement of the American soldier's ability to fight. The Battle of the Bulge fundamentally changed the perception of American forces on all sides. It proved that the U.S. Army, even its greenest elements, could stand up to and defeat the best of the veteran German units. The replacements earned their stripes not through careful planning, but through sheer, bloody endurance. Their performance in the Ardennes destroyed the final vestiges of German confidence in a potential Western victory. The psychological turning point of the battle was as important as the physical one. The Germans realized the American will to fight was unbroken and its ability to supply its troops was inexhaustible. This shift in perspective among the German veterans was a true measure of the replacement's success. The story of the GI replacements in the Ardennes is a powerful and often overlooked chapter in military history. It is a tale of resilience, transformation, and the harsh forging of soldiers in the heat of battle. These men, initially mocked by their veteran foes, prove that courage is not a function of experience alone. It is the function of duty, determination, and the deep, immediate need to survive for one another. The replacements' stand at the Bulge ensured that the German army could not achieve its objective. Their sacrifice bought the time necessary for the veterans to regroup and launch the final, decisive counterattack. Their actions were a pivotal moment that accelerated the end of the war in Europe. The Ardennes is now a place of somber reflection, a memorial to the young men who came to Europe and fought their first and last battle there. Their legacy is cemented in the numerous small memorials and quiet cemeteries scattered throughout the Belgian forests. The replacement unit's performance is a timeless lesson in the dangers of underestimating an enemy. It is a tribute to the human capacity to rise to the occasion when faced with overwhelming adversity. The forest of the Ardennes, once a symbol of a strategic vacuum, became a symbol of American resilience. The greenhorns proved themselves to be tough, unyielding combat soldiers. Their names and their stories live on as a reminder of the quiet courage of the citizen soldier. The mockery ended when the guns began to fire. The respect was earned in the deepest snow and the coldest winter of the war. The legacy of the replacements is the legacy of victory itself.